tidbits on the weekly Torah portion. And welcome back. We have been here for a few weeks. God willing, we hope to continue this every week as Hashem, as God will permit us. This week we have another double header, Tazria and Metzora, both of which discuss a very strange concept, the concept of tsaras, a skin disease that has been mistranslated as leprosy. Some people suggest that the word psoriasis comes from the word tsaras. Whatever the truth is about that, this is a skin disease, and it was considered to be an unnatural one that rendered the person so afflicted with what is called tuma, impurity, but not a physical impurity, but a spiritual impurity that required a certain purification process. So the theme of this week's Torah portion, both portions, deals with the concept of purity and impurity and the different types of impurity. It's not just tsaras that it talks about other forms of impurity based on different conditions, biological conditions. Now, the Torah portion of Tazria, first of the two portions, begins with the laws of childbirth, which renders the mother ritually, spiritually impure, which is a concept that needs clarification. It doesn't mean, God forbid, that giving birth is a dirty thing or improper thing, but because it is the holiest physical event that can possibly take place, that's why a person, after it takes place, is more susceptible to impurity. And that's the point that I'd like to discuss briefly, that the concept of impurity in Judaism is related to the concept of holiness. Only something that is holy, has the potential of holiness, also has the potential for the opposite of holiness, impurity. So when you see impurity, it's a sign that this person who is rendered impure is really connected to something very spiritual and very holy, and the impurity is just a sign that there is a challenge that is always associated with something that is holy. And this ties in with what Rashi tells us, quoting the Midrash, that if we read last week's Torah portion, it was about the laws concerning kosher and non-kosher, pure and impure animals. And now we're talking about pure and impure people. So people come after the animals. So Rashi says that's consistent with the story of creation, in which the animals were created first and then human beings. Well, that sounds like animals take precedence over human beings. Animals are more preferred over human beings. And some people would argue that's true because animals don't do any evil. They can only do what they're programmed to do, and it's not something that is connected to an evil impulse, whereas humans have that potential for evil, as we've seen and we continue to see in society how much evil people can do. So that points to the inferiority of humanity over the rest of creation. But the Talmud in Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin, says that the reason why God created man at the end was because man, humanity, is superior to any other part of creation. So God puts us at the end, so everything should be ready for us. So it seems that there are two contradictory explanations. One is that we're the lowliest, and the other is that we're the highest. One way of understanding it, that they're not two separate aspects of humanity. Because we are the lowliest, well, let's put it the other way around. Because we are the highest, therefore we have the potential to become the lowliest. Because only someone who is at a high level can fall very low. Someone who's at a very low level, they can't fall very low because they're already low. They can't go any lower. So the degradation that a human being could experience is directly caused by the exalted nature of humanity. And that's why when a woman gives birth, which is the highest point of humanity in terms of the biological system, because that's when new life comes into the world, new divine energy comes into the world, that's when she is susceptible. That's when she's been told, you've just been connected to something very holy. You should know there are pitfalls, there are challenges that are associated with holiness. Then the Torah goes on to talk about how on the 8th day, the boy, if it's a boy obviously, should be circumcised, and this has become one of the most central precepts of Jewish life. The Talmud says that the mitzvahs that the Jewish people accepted with joy, they still observe with joy. And that involves the mitzvah of circumcision, which they accepted with joy, although it is painful to the baby. That's one of the reasons we don't recite the blessing Shehecheyanu, thanking God for having lived to experience this great occasion, this milestone, because you don't say that blessing whenever there's any tsar, whenever there's any pain, although Sephardic Jews do say the blessing, Ashkenazic Jews do not for that reason, but nevertheless it's still something that everyone comes, it's a celebration. So even though it's painful and it's difficult for a parent to see the child being cut, we still do it with simcha, with joy. Those commandments that we accepted reluctantly, begrudgingly, always has never really caught on, and we don't do it with such joy and relish. So circumcision is considered to be a very central part of Judaism. It's the covenant that God made with Abraham that is the imprint on every Jewish boy. What about the women? The Talmud says a woman is considered to be circumcised by nature, by God himself. That's why they're allowed to eat of the paschal offering, which cannot be eaten by someone who's uncircumcised. But women have the spiritual advantage of circumcision without having to go through, which points to a concept which requires a lot more elaboration. But the way Judaism, Torah, especially Kabbalah and Hasidic thought, views the difference between men and women, spiritually speaking, and this is a generalization, is that men are created with a lot of spiritual energy, but it's chaotic energy. It's energy that is not tailor-made for that person. And it has to be curbed, it has to be controlled. It's not the way it ought to be, it's the way it can be if it is subjected to the right protections. And one of those protections is circumcision. There are also other mitzvahs that men do that are there to curb the man's intense energy, which can be translated into a negative direction. That's why we put on tefillin on our left arm, our weaker arm, because we have to shore up our weaknesses and so on and so forth. We wear tzitzis, the fringes, as a reminder we should not go astray to follow what our eyes and hearts desire. So the mitzvahs that are given to men, beginning with circumcision, are there to control the energy. Women, on the other hand, were created tailor-made with the right amount of spiritual energy, not more than what they need, and of course not less than what they need, and therefore they do not have the need for all these special protections that are afforded to men by virtue of their commandments that are directed to men. So we have circumcision on the 8th day. Now, whenever you go to a bris and they bring in the baby, and after the bris is over, the mohel, the circumciser, says certain prayers, and at the end everyone announces Kshem shenichnas lebris, Ken Yikonas L'Torah U'Lechupu L'Maisim Tovim. Just as he entered into the covenant, so shall he enter into Torah, the study of Torah, Chuppah, canopy, which is a reference to marriage, U'Masim Tovim, and good deeds. So one interpretation of this that I once heard, and it's an old Hasidic interpretation, why are we comparing Torah, Chuppah, Masim Tovim, Torah, marriage, and good deeds to the bris? Because the bris is unique in that the child who goes through the bris, who's the object of the bris, has no ulterior motives. He's not doing it for fame, for money, for pleasure. On the contrary. And of course the baby has no understanding. But it's the purest form of a mitzvah. And we ask and we pray that we should take some of the spirit of purity of doing a mitzvah with sincerity, without any ulterior motives, through all of our spiritual lives, when we study Torah, when we get married, and when we do mitzvahs. But here are two questions. Number one, we say, just as we entered into the covenant, so shall we enter into Torah. Presumably, when does a child start learning Torah? Even before, as soon as the child starts to talk, the father is supposed to teach him actually the word, the verse that begins with the word Torah. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Torah was commanded to us by Moses. Okay, so that's Torah. The next thing is chuppah. we're skipping over many years. We skip over the bar mitzvah, and the next thing is chuppah, which is marriage. Usually, marriage does not take place, even in the olden days, before 18. It says in Ethics of the Fathers, Ben Shmona Esrei L'chuppah. When you're 18, that's the ideal age for marriage. So we skip from the bris, from 8 days, to, let's say, the age of 3, when the child starts saying words of Torah, and we skip over to the age of 18. And then we say, Masim Tovim, good deeds. Aren't good deeds something you're supposed to do at least from the time of your bar mitzvah, if not earlier? So why do we skip bar mitzvah and we put good deeds after marriage? You mean before you get married, good deeds are not important? This is a possible explanation that we're talking about different periods in a person's life that you enter into. Good deeds over here does not mean observance of the mitzvahs. Good deeds means when your life is no longer about yourself. As long as you're still a child, even an adolescent, a teenager, up until the age of 20, it says in Ethics of the Fathers, when you reach the age of 20, that's the age and the milestone of lirdov, to pursue a living, which in spiritual terms means the age of 20, you have the right understanding that you could impart some of your knowledge to others. You could influence and inspire others. Of course, you can do that before, but that's the ideal age when you are most adequately prepared. That not only are you doing what is right, mitzvahs, that you do because of your personal obligation and growth, but these are good deeds because you are sharing your information and influencing others. You're taking over the world. You're conquering the world. You're making the world a dwelling place for God. Until you get out into the world, your influence on the world is indirect. Here it's a direct influence. So when the baby is circumcised, he enters into a covenant, and that serves the person's entire life. That covenant is there from the age of 8 days until the person passes away. Then there's the introduction to Torah, to the study of Torah, to the knowledge of Torah. That starts when the child is very young, and it continues the rest of his life. It doesn't start at bar mitzvah, it starts before. But then, the next stage is when you start to make an impact on the rest of the world. And that's at the age of 20, and that comes after marriage, which traditionally would happen at the age of 18. 18, that's the bridge between your own personal life and the world, because that's when you're married and responsible for another person. You might have a child or two by the time you're 20. So that is the bridge between that which you do for yourself and that which you're going to do to change and affect the whole world. Now let's skip over to the end of the parsha, of the double parsha, because we usually talk a lot about the beginning of the parsha, sometimes the middle, but we leave the end out because we never reach the end. So this time, let's go to the end of Parshas Metzora. There's a verse, chapter 15, verse 13. After the Torah describes a certain type of impurity caused by bodily fluid, the name of the person who has that impurity is called the Zav. When he's purified, he should count 7 days for his purification. And it goes on to discuss the purification in Mayim Chayim, in living waters. That means waters that are coming from a spring. And then he becomes purified. And the 8th day, after counting 7 days, the next verse continues, he should take 2 birds, and he comes before God to the entrance of the Ohel Moed, the tabernacle, and he gives them to the Kohen. And the Kohen takes the 2 birds. One of them is a sin offering, one of them is a burnt offering. And that's complete atonement from this impurity. That's when the person has completely been restored to his original state of purity and holiness. It has been pointed out by one of the Hasidic masters that these verses that talk about the purification of the Zav is, the 2 verses combined have 49 words. And when we say the number 49 in Judaism, immediately, especially in the present time we're in now, anyone who's familiar with the Jewish tradition, and if you ask him what is 49, he'll tell you the 49 days that we count between Pesach, Passover, and Shavuos. These are the 49 days called the counting of the Omer. The Omer was a measure of barley that was brought on the second day of Passover in the temple, and from that day on they're supposed to count each day, another day, until we get to the 50th day, which we don't count, but that's the day in which we celebrate Shavuos, the anniversary of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And these 49 days are not just intended as days of anticipation, which they are, but they are days of purification as well. Every day we refine and purify another one of our 49 different emotional traits. There are a total of 7 emotional general traits. Each of them consists of and comprises all the other 7. 7 times 7 is, of course, 49. So this verse, which talks about an individual's impurity that he has to count, has 49 words. And then he points out a very interesting, fascinating thing. That when you go to the 18th, to the 14th word of these verses, you get to the word Uba Lifnei Hashem, and he comes before God. The word God is the 14th word, and the significance of that is that the 14th, that is the 29th, which coincides with the 14th day of the month of Iyar, which is Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. And that's the day that we come before God. What does that mean? Why is that more coming before God than any other holiday? The Zohar says that Pesach Sheni, all the gates are open then before the person. A person can enter in through the gates when he couldn't have done that previously. What is the significance of Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, which we'll be celebrating in another 10 days? Pesach Sheni is the second opportunity a person has to bring the Paschal offering. In the Torah, we're going to read later on in the book of Numbers how a group of people, the second year the Jews were in the desert and were told to do the Paschal offering on Passover, and they said, we can't do it because we have become ritually impure by coming in contact with the dead, and we are therefore not allowed to do the Paschal offering, and why should we be diminished? Why should we be deprived of that opportunity? And God told Moses, after Moses consulted with God because he was stumped, that he should tell them that there was another opportunity a month later, exactly a month later, on the 14th of Iyar, month from the 14th of Nisan, and they'll bring the Paschal offering then. What is the lesson over here? That even if a person misses an opportunity, they could always make up. And not only that, even if you miss the opportunity, not because of some accident that occurred, factors that are beyond your control, even if it was due to negligence, and even if it was intentional, and even if you had in mind that you're going to correct it later on. Generally speaking, if you sin, knowing ahead of time that I'm sinning because I know I can repent later on, then it says they don't give you the opportunity to do tshuva, to repent. Which the Alter Rebbe says doesn't mean you can't repent, but that it becomes very, very difficult. And here, the Torah makes it easy for you to bring this Paschal offering. This means that Pesach Sheni has a power that even conventional tshuva, repentance, doesn't have. It can get rid of everything that you did wrong in this regard. That means that gates are open on this day that are not open any other time, and that's hinted in the words that correspond to the 14th day of Iyar, the 29th day of the Omer. You come before God, and this is unique to Pesach Sheni. Then we get to the 33rd word, and that is the word Moed, which is the meaning of the word festival. What's the 33rd day of the Omer, of the counting? That is the holiday of Lag BaOmer. Lag being 33 of the Omer. It's the day that we celebrate. All the rest of the 49 days are days that have limited mourning because of the death of the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva who perished during this period. Lag BaOmer is considered to be a holiday for 2 reasons. One reason is because that's when Rabbi Akiva's students ceased dying. There was no death on that day. And the main reason is because that's when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Akiva's student, who was the author of the Zohar, the most important work of Kabbalah, that's the day he passed on, telling his disciples that this should be a day of celebration because this is the day that his soul is reunited with his Maker, and he revealed to them the deepest secrets of Torah, which became the basis of Kabbalah, of all of the mystical teachings of Judaism, including the teachings of Hasidus. And this day was designated by him as a festival, and that's hinted in the word moed over here. Later on, in verse 31, the Torah admonishes us to be very careful about not entering the temple, the sanctuary, in a state of impurity. And it says, V'hizartem as Bnei Yisrael, that's verse 31, you shall separate the children of Israel from their contamination. The word V'hizartem, Rashi says, means separating. It's the same root as the word Nazir, the man who makes, a woman who makes a vow not to drink wine and not to cut their hair and so on. That person is separated from the rest of society in that regard, separates himself from different activities. So a person should separate himself from their impurity, and that way they will be guaranteed not to suffer any death by contaminating the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, in which exists amongst them. So the Hasidic masters have taken the word Hizartem. The root of this word are two letters, which can read the word Zer, which means a crown. That when a Jew is careful to avoid contamination, impurity, spiritual impurity we're talking about, that creates a crown on his head. That means one should not think, as many people often do, that the absence of something negative is not automatically a positive. I'll give you a simple example. If someone passes a bank and doesn't rob the bank, no one's going to give him a medal saying what an honorable person he is, how wonderful this person is that they didn't commit a crime. Or if you see someone that doesn't find favor in your eyes and you don't punch them in the face, don't demand a medal for that, saying that I'm a special person because of that. But Judaism has a little bit of a different take on that. When a person resists temptation, when a person avoids a negative situation, even though they may be attracted to it, they are given this crown on their head. They generate a spiritual energy that is likened to a crown. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, in his classic work, Likutei Torah, explains that while it may seem, and very often we emphasize the point, that a positive mitzvah is more important and we should put greater emphasis on than just avoiding to do negative things. Of course, we have to work on not doing negative things. But where is it really at? Judaism is really at the positive, doing positive, and there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also a truth to the idea that resisting negative has more energy, generates more energy, positive energy, than just doing something that is good. And the rationale behind that is, in spite of the fact that we always say that positive, bringing a little light, dispels darkness, and positive mitzvahs override the negative, because when you generate light, spiritual light, godly light, through a positive commandment, that light is something that's within your reach. You can find a vessel, a vehicle, an instrument to generate that light, the act of the mitzvah. You put on tefillin, the tefillin act becomes the vehicle for that light. It can be absorbed, it can be accessed. Whereas when you do a negative, it means when you avoid violating a negative commandment, there's no action over there. There's nothing that you can do to contain that light. So that light becomes something that is generated, but it's not absorbed, it's not internalized. Where is the light higher? When you fulfill and observe a negative commandment. It's a higher light, but it's not light that you can internalize as easily. That may be hinted in the word v'hizartem, which, as we said before, the root of the word can mean crown. A crown is above the head. It's something that's not in you, it's above you. Another point is that the same word, zer, if you reverse the letters, it spells raz. Raz means secret. It also was the same numerical value as light. They both add up to 207. What does that tell you? That when you avoid impurity, you generate a secret light, a light that is concealed, that is beyond us, and eventually, of course, it'll be internalized. In the Messianic age, all the energy that we generate today, whether it's positive mitzvahs or whether we fulfill the negative mitzvahs, we don't get the full effect of them. Even of the positive that we could internalize, it's not the full effect of it. It's like taking some nutrients and for some reason the body expels most of it and you only get a little bit of it. It's better than nothing. But when Mashiach comes in the Messianic age, we will be able to fully internalize all of the light. Even the secret light will become revealed. We get a taste of that secret light every time we study the secrets of the Torah, which have been preserved for us in the teachings of Kabbalah, but especially in the teachings of Hasidus, because Hasidus is Kabbalah, and this is oversimplifying it, of course. We don't have time to go into greater depth, but it's Kabbalah that is accessible to the human beings. It's the inner light of Torah, the deepest secrets, made accessible to the human mind. So we get a taste of that before Mashiach. One of the reasons given why these secrets of the Torah, which were kept secret for so many centuries, why have they been revealed in recent times, since the Baal Shem Tov, who passed away a little over 200 years ago, but not before then. And one of the reasons is because that we need it more than any other time. The Jewish state of the Jewish people is so downtrodden, so crushed, that we needed something to rejuvenate us. But the second, perhaps primary reason is because this is a taste of the Messianic age, when we will be taught by Mashiach himself all of the deepest secrets of the Torah. To appreciate it then, we have to whet our appetite now and get a little sample of it, which is how we get the secrets of the Torah revealed to us now. That's all hinted in the word V'hizartem, and you shall admonish, or separate the people from the impurity, but it also means you will give them a crown and you will reveal to them the secrets when we avoid any type of impurity. Now let me go back to the middle of the parsha, now that we took care of the end. When a Metzora purifies himself, one of the plants that he has to use in the sprinkling of the blood, which we won't go into detail, is the plant that is a cedar, Eitz Eretz, from a cedar, which is a very tall and majestic tree. And he also takes this tulas, an azov, hyssop, another plant which is very small, very low, is a symbol of humility. So you're talking about both arrogance and humility, because the tzaras that a person has was a result of a person's arrogance. And when a person has to atone for the arrogance, they have to do something that symbolizes the humility. And in conjunction with this, I'd like to just share an interesting anecdote. One of the Hasidic rabbis, Rabbi Naftali of Brashad, used to say, when I come above to the heavenly court, I have a good defense for all my sins, except for one. Gaiva, arrogance, inflated ego. He says, this is how it's going to work. He said, they're going to ask me the first question, did you study Torah? And I have a good defense for that. I says, no. I'm an ignorant person, and I didn't know how to learn. Obviously, this man was a very holy man, a very great scholar, but the more a person knows and the more humble they are, the more they realize how little they know. Well, if you didn't study Torah because you didn't have the intellectual capacity, did you at least put your life into your prayers, into your davening? Did you conduct yourself in an ascetic way, but not overindulging, and so on and so forth? Did you fast? And I said, I have a good answer to that. I was too weak. I didn't have the strength to really put my full kavanah, full concentration and energy in my prayers and so on. Okay, you have a good excuse for that. What, but you give a lot of tzedakah? He says, no, I couldn't. I was poor. It wasn't my fault. Ah, they'll say, if that's the case, you're an ignoramus. You were weak. You couldn't serve God with prayer. and you couldn't give tzedakah because you were poor, so why are you such a big shot? Why are you so arrogant? He says, for that, I don't have any answer. But Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev would say, if not for the fact that the Torah books talk about arrogance and ego, I couldn't possibly believe how it's possible for a human being, a lowly human being, who's here today and gone tomorrow, could be arrogant. Well, Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev could say that he needed to read it in the books, which reminds us of how life will be like in the Messianic age. Then we'll be reading in the Torah and other holy books that there was a time in which people were arrogant and people did other sins. We will not be able to experience that, but we'll know that it was true because we'll read about it in the Torah. One other point. When the Metzora is purified, they had to use mayim chayim, living waters. Living waters means not water that's collected from rainwater, water from a tap in our case, but it has to be water that comes from a spring. It's constantly regenerating its flow of water. Why does purification of the Metzora, as opposed to any other type of purification through a sacrifice, did it require this mayim chayim, this living waters? And the given answer to that is, the Metzora, who's going through a purification process, before he's purified, he's quarantined. He has to sit outside the walls of the city all by himself, which is probably the reason why people thought this means leprosy, because lepers had leper colonies. This is not leprosy, it's not a contagious disease, but it was part of his punishment because tzaras came for various sins. Among them, I mentioned before, person's haughtiness, another one is the person's stinginess, another one is his lashon hara, speaking evil of others. So it's a punishment, and he's all alone, he's isolated, and he also has to be humbled as a result of his impurity. That's dangerous, because when a person is all by himself and is humbled, it may lead to depression. And even this man who has to atone for his sins, who's not considered to have done the right thing, we will not allow him to fall into depression. That's why the Torah says, take living waters. Make sure that he sees the sign of life, that as soon as there's depression, and as soon as there's inaction that's caused by depression, person is inert. That is a symbol of death. And the person has to take this living waters to know that no matter how far you have fallen, no matter how much purification you need, you never allow yourselves to fall into the depths of depression. Just one final thought. When the Torah speaks about the different types of skin diseases, it goes on to talk about garments that have become diseased, and then it talks about a home, a house. And that house had to be demolished if the disease persisted. And the Midrash tells us a fascinating thing, that when the house was demolished, they would find the treasures they would put there by the Canaanites. Knowing that the Jews were going to conquer the land, they didn't want them to take their treasures. They said, rather than them getting it, we won't get it, but we'll put it away in the walls and they will never find those treasures. And by this type of disease, tzaras of the house, they would have to demolish the walls and they would find the treasures. So the question is, why did God have to give them the treasures in such a way? If God wanted the Jews to have treasures, he didn't have to do it in a way where the Canaanites had to hide it in the walls and they had to break the walls, and it was a pretty uncomfortable thing to have to break down the walls of your house. Okay, later on you find the treasure, but the ideal thing would be to have the treasures in the first place. So there's a deeper lesson in this, that no matter how much a person thinks they are diseased, they think their whole house is a metaphor for their existence. Their whole existence in this world is a diseased existence. The truth of the matter is that they are still filled with treasures. Every one of us, no matter how low they may have fallen, no matter how desperate things seem to be, have to know that they do possess this treasure within them. And sometimes it takes the person hitting the rock bottom, because there's no greater impurity than saras, because in any other type of impurity, whether you touch a dead body, whether a person has a biological loss of fluid that causes them to become ritually impure, whether it's blood or other substances, the person is not completely quarantined. He can't go into the temple, certain parts of the temple, but the Metzora has to be outside of the city limits entirely. That's like the farthest you can go from a place of holiness. That person has to know that they are not a lost cause. They have treasures embedded within them. Have a good evening. Shabbat Shalom. Have a good Shabbos.